Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we want to do another SSD review, and we are revisiting the brand and the label WD and their WD Black series. Now, for those that aren't aware, real quick, this is not the first WD Black SSD. Hell, it's not even the first WD Black PCIe Gen 4 SSD. That, of course, would be this. This is the WD Black SN850, and we will be comparing these two in a later video. But I've got to say right now that a lot of you may have come to this video because you've heard about this brand new SSD, and you're sort of going, what do you mean it's new? It's been around for ages. And that's right. The WD Black range of SSD, they were one of the first brands, Western Digital, to jump on board with commercially available 7,000 megabytes per second performance SSDs, particularly for hardcore gamers, but of course those of the content creation persuasion. These are people that have looked at this and SSDs from things like the Samsung 980 Pro and then the later released Segatae Firecuda and went, ooh, I'm going to get me some of that. So why has WD released a new version of this SSD? Is it replacing the old one? It's not. Is it better than the old one? Not really. Why does it exist? What does it do? What are the good? What are the bad? And of course, that's why you've come to today's video. So, this WD Black SN770, it is kind of a subdivision of that series, because a number of you looked at the SSD that came before it, now released almost, 2 years ago, and thought about that and went, well, the WD Black SN850 is great, but it's really, really expensive, and do I need that performance? And after all of this time, although other ranges and other SSD brands out there have released subdivisions, such as Seagate releasing their Firecuda 520 first, Samsung releasing a lesser version of their 980 series, WD Black have released the SN7700, and this SSD, although it doesn't hit the highs of the 850, it arrives at a much more affordable price point, is far more power efficient, and ultimately arrives at a lesser but arguably more reasonable tier in the storage environment. So let's look at the box. Again, very similar to its predecessor. We're looking at the 1TB. This SSD arrives in 250 gig, 500 gig, 1TB and 2TB versions. If we open this bad boy up, there's not going to be a lot of content inside there. Again, that's all we're getting inside that box. I do like the WD Black retail packaging. I've talked about that before. We've got information in there on the first time utilization and the warranty. It arrives with 5 years of manufacturer's warranty, just like the other one. So they haven't kind of cut corners on the support and warranty, which is good. Inside the plastic shell, of course, there we have our single-sided SSD. Now, we'll come back to this later on, but take a very close look at the alignment of the chips on that board. We've got one big old SanDisk NAND chip there that we'll talk about later on. And right there at the top, we've got the controller of this SSD. Now, this is actually quite an unusual layout of chips and components. And again, this comes down to that idea of efficiency that we'll touch on later on. But first up, let's talk a little bit about some of the basics. It's a PCIe Gen 4x4 SSD, but of course that does mean it's backwards compatible with Gen 3 and such. It's a 2280 length SSD. I will say straight away, do not consider this as a PS5 upgrade. Reasons for that are going to become clearer later on, but in brief, the performance, you're not going to get PS5 level performance out of this SSD. On top of that, the pricing structure of this, starting at its lowest tier, the official RRP is $59, $79, $129, and $269 on the 250, 500 gig, 1TB and 2TB respectively. But already, even since launch, we've seen prices already a little bit more affordable than that, knocking around on Amazon, most of your retail outlets out there. I will say that compared to the WD Black fully fledged version, released again a year and a half to 2 years prior, depending on when you're watching this, the price difference is around 20 to 30%. So that's a big old chunk. That's $20 to $30 on the 100 at each tier and escalating each time. So again, I can see the affordability appealing to a number of people out there. Where have, for want of a better word, compromises taken place? Well, First and foremost, we can talk a little bit about the controller. It's taking advantage of a coaxial in-house controller, like most WD components out there. Pretty much everything's in-house. And that controller, although the specifics are always very difficult to sort of tease out of WD there, it's a lesser controller than the one that's utilised in the other WD Black, that full premium package version there. Another thing worth highlighting is the NAND. It takes advantage of 112 layer 3D TLC NAND, which is surprisingly of a higher quality than that of the WD Black SN850. And again, I'll go into more detail on the comparison for that, but that's because of its more modern development. They've managed to factor in that slightly higher layer count on that 3D in-house NAND there. But one thing this lacks substantially, notably, hence the big old gap and something else we'll talk about, it's RAMless. It doesn't have memory. It does not have DRAM. Now, for those of quite new onto SSDs, I'm going to try and simplify it as much as I can. Think of this SSD like a computer, like a laptop, anything really. This little bit at the top there, that controller, that's the brain, it's the CPU. That little blob there, that's the NAND, that's where your data lives. And a computer, that'll be your hard drive or your SSD. Now a computer has memory, random access memory, RAM. And these are effectively the hands, the fingers, whatever, to deal with processes on the fly. The larger the task, or the larger the active process, the more memory that's going to be occupied there. Now, most SSDs arrive with an area of memory on board to assist as a buffer, to assist the CPU and the processing of data. And you do tend to see like for like, say 1 TB SSD will have a gig of memory. 2 TB SSD will have 2 gig of memory inside there. Now this SSD takes advantage of something called HMB, Host Memory Buffer. And as you may be able to tell from that name, that means this has no memory. It utilizes a portion of the resources of the host system. It doesn't take up a vast amount, but it uses a little bit of the host system memory, allocates it to the SSD. So rather than it being handled on board for reasons of power efficiency, for reasons of general efficiency, it's using the stuff that's in your system. Now, that can be a limiting factor in a number of ways. First and foremost, if your system is not compatible to provide HMB, the result is that the SSD will throttle quite significantly. That's one of the reasons why its utility in PS5 is highly unrecommended. The second thing is when you're dealing with larger processes, big sequential data, heavy, consistent, sustained use, the memory allocation of the system is just not going to work and not be fluid enough. And ultimately, that's why you'll see reports of SSDs that used host memory buffer. If you sustain use them, the performance can drop astronomically. So again, that is a very important factor when looking at SSDs like this. That's not really a criticism of this. They've been completely upfront. Western Digital have been very, very plain about that. There are lots of host memory buffer kind of architecture SSDs in the market. There's a reason they adopt the value or mid-range tier there underneath the premium. I will also add the layout of that is also for reasons of heat efficiency. Those chips being far apart is going to be very useful. There isn't a first-party heatsink version as you find on that SN850 there. This is an SSD designed for the middle. It's not designed for the super cost efficient, but it's certainly not designed for the premium there. Now, the impact of that architecture will be felt in the performance. So for the, if we look at the reported sequential read and write, it reaches a maximum on the highest tier of 5,150 megabytes per second reported sequential read, and in write 4,850. That puts it a little lower than some of the other SSDs out there at this kind of value tier there. But it's also arriving a lot more affordable than a number of those. Again, thanks to that architecture. Now, obviously that's the top end. If you go to the lower end, the 250 gig model, you're looking at 4,000 megabytes per second over 2,000 megabytes per second there. But it is still a very affordable SSD for those of you that have got a PCIe Gen 4 M.2 system, but haven't got the rest of the architecture or indeed the necessity to hit 7,000 megs. This may be well enough for you. Now, in terms of 4K random IOPS, it has to be said again, it's not hitting the millions that more enterprise or prosumer SSD hits, maxing out at 740,000 4K read random IOPS, and in write maxing out at 800,000. But again, that is at the highest tier. As you go into the lower performance tiers, those number two go the lower capacity tiers, those numbers will drill down a little bit. Now, in terms of durability, we've kind of got a bit of a mixed bag here. The durability at each tier does kind of fluctuate. At its lowest, it's 0.33, I believe, maxing out at 0.44 drive writes per day. Again, with the larger capacities given the slightly lowest endurance there. And again, that's a little bit to do with NAND distribution being a much smaller NAND distribution across all of them, but also that efficiency. As long as you maintain within that performance line there, then you should live within the reported endurance factor. So that would be 200 terabytes written, 400 terabytes, 200 terabytes written, 300 terabytes written, 600 terabytes written, and 1200 terabytes written, from the smallest to the largest capacity there. So again, between 0.3 and around 0.4 and a bit drive writes per day. Comparable to that of the WD Black, it has to be the WD Black SN850, it has to be said, while still maintaining a far more streamlined architecture and more layers there on the NAND. It is certainly a more affordable alternative for that lower price point, but where does that reflect in terms of performance? Let's get this inside our test machine. Now, during our test, we'll of course be looking at temperatures as always. We will be utilizing this drive with a heatsink on board there. Again, we'll debate whether to use it with or without, do a comparison to and from, but I do think, at least in terms of comparing the performance later on, we have to see. The second thing we're also going to be looking at there is the sustained performance, because that lack of onboard DRAM is going to be detrimental long term to more sustained performance, and I think it's really important that we explore that avenue. But otherwise, let's get on the test machine and do this thing and put it through its paces with the likes of AJ8, Crystal Disk, AS SSD and more. Let's go. Okay, so here we are on the desktop of my test machine here. Just above me, as you can see, there is our WD Black SN770 1TB there. You can see it's been powered on for about 60 odd hours. We did some other tests for some other videos there, and we're running on NVMe 1.4 and using the full available bandwidth there, as you can see there on screen. Left hand side of the screen, we've got the data sheet there that details some of the details from WD themselves about what this drive indeed is capable of. And again, what we're looking at more than anything is we're looking at that 1TB model. It's the second entry from the top on every single one of those. And again, the pricing available from WD is pretty competitive right now, but I know there's some deals knocking around there online over on Amazon. Now, what we're going to do in today's video is we're going to go ahead immediately and start assigning this drive. So you're going to see me doing that live. So we're just going to go straight into the management panel there. Find the drive, mount it as a standard external. So we're not going to be utilizing it as the OS drive. We are using that M.2 slot, so it's not being utilized for the OS. As you can see, there's our drive there in the middle. Right click, create a nice new volume. I'm going to go ahead and complete that, give it the letter W just for the sake of ease. I'm going to call this one SN770 1TB. In fact, why not? Let's go the whole hog and call it WD Black. I can't quite see my my keyboard over the microphone. Give it a quick format, and that should make our drive appear nice and quickly. So there it is. There's our available drive there on screen. Again, we're going to ignore that soft RAID pop-up. Get rid of that there. And as you can see, we've now assigned our letter. Now, as always, whenever I'm doing any test, it doesn't matter whether we're using this drive or not, because I'm using screen recording software that can impinge a lot of the resources. I'm currently using OBS, as you can see there. And when I am using OBS, OBS has a tendency to use a lot of the system resources. So as you can see there, it's already using a big old chunk of memory, but the real thing to bear in mind is that GPU utilization there. And in this case, because we're looking at an SSD with that DRAM absent on board, concerns towards system resources are going to be slightly higher than what we're normally used to here in the test area. So I'm just going to walk you through the test I'm going to do, and then I'm going to do the tests without screen recording here, and then from that come back to the screen and then go through the results with you. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is Crystal Disk. So in the Crystal Disk benchmark there, we're going to be doing a 1 GB, 4 GB and 16 GB test file, and I'm going to be very interested to see how this SSD handles that 16 GB test given the lack of onboard memory. On top of that, we're also going to be running Atto Disk Benchmark. Again, if you are seeing that black screen appear there on screen, that's because of Windows doing its it needs authentication from the admin there. So it's going to do that every time I open one of these more core applications. And again, in Atto, we're going to be doing 3 tests, 256 MB, that's 1/4 of a gig, 1 gig and 4 gig. Within, we're going to be running ASSSD. ASSSD utilized here is going to be taking care of a 1, a 3 and a 5 GB test file. And finally at the end, I'm going to be using AJA, and in AJA just a 1, a 4 and a 16 GB 1080p video file. Again, we're going to be looking at 2 things there. One, we're going to be looking at the sustained performance, very important. And the second thing is we're going to be looking at the graph on the bottom when we do the AJA tests rather than the numbers at the top, because the graph will give us a better indication of how the drive is dealing with this heftier file over time. And that's really it. Those are the tests that we're going to run. It should take around about an hour to an hour and a half. If we go into the graph there, we can work out and see more information on the temperature of the SSD. And at the moment, it's running at a nice steady 40°C, but I fully anticipate that number to go quite high as we utilize it throughout our testing there. But for now, what I'm going to do is close OBS, do all of our testing and come back. The time now is exactly 2 o'clock on the 14th of March. So I should be back with you in the next hour or so. Thank you so much, and I'll fast forward now. Okay, so our testing completed, and it took a little over an hour, about an hour and 12-15 minutes there. So let's go a little bit through our results. So the first thing I want to talk about is, of course, temperatures. And I've got to say, this SSD, as you can see here, it did get rather hot. That was kind of expected there, peaking at 66 degrees there. Throughout our testing there at the top. Again, you can kind of see where the heaviest test patterns were. Here was when we were doing our Crystal Disk, and over here when we were doing our Atto Disk benchmark testing here, something you're going to see in just a moment. And while we're going through this testing, I do think it is kind of worth seeing how our results compared to that of the WD Black SN850 there. If we have a little look and we look at the temperature there, this was the temperature of the 850 when we were doing our testing with that one. It was, again, a 1 TB drive, and that peaked at around 61, and that was the one that had the proprietary heatsink on board there. So, again, although these numbers aren't exactly fantastic, I will say that I'm impressed that the 2 SSDs aren't actually that far apart, given the proprietary heatsink there on the SN850. So if we leave the performance there of the temperature, we can talk a little bit more about how the SSD compared on its own. Remember that in terms of sequential performance is what we're going to look at next. We want to exceed 5,000, or at least hit 5,150 at the very top, and in terms of write, 4,900 there. So if we get rid of that, next up we'll look at Crystal Disk. And if we have a look, overall, I'm happy with what we're seeing there. Overall, we can see that we broke that 5,001, and remember, we had to beat 5,150 over 4,900, and although the 4,900 was only broken on the 1 gig, and we started to see the number going a tiniest bit down on write on the 4 and 16 gig testing, overall, the read tests were absolutely fantastic, exceeding that of what the brand said. IOS performance a little lower, but of course we are using a relatively mid-range system there. If we have a look, you're able to see I'm running a Windows 10 system there overall. So again, with 16 gig of memory, it's by no means an 8 or 12 core Xeon there, which a lot of the testing would have originally been hosted on. As you can see there, the original benchmark for that test, if we scroll down, we're able to see that it was quite a powerful little PC that they were running for that Crystal Disk benchmark there. A test of which we couldn't possibly have got near to with our testing 11th Gen i5 versus 11th Gen i9 there. So again, still great numbers there for Crystal Disk. Coming out of Crystal Disk, we can go into Atto Disk Benchmark, and we're going to have a little look at the standard read-write practice there at sequential. And again, nice, interesting numbers there. Not going to be as high as the synthetic numbers we saw on Crystal Disk, but still pretty good numbers there overall. And again, if we make our way back into the WD Black there, not only can we see there on screen those numbers, although higher on the SN850 as expected, if we make our way into Atto Disk benchmark and compare them side by side, so we look at the one versus the one, we can definitely see a disparity there between them, but still hitting the numbers within the benchmark figure. Do bear in mind, Atto doesn't use the same mathematics as Crystal Disk does on its working of megabytes versus gigabytes. But yep, great numbers we're seeing there. And if we flick on to the IOPS there between the two of them, so if we go for the 1 gigabyte IOPS there, we're able to see the numbers again still pretty good overall. And again, as we hit the middle there, we're able to see consistent higher numbers on the 850, but still nothing too much to worry about there. And overall, I'm still quite pleased with those numbers we're seeing there, both in terms of IOPS and in terms of sequential read-write on a mid-range SSD, remember. So coming out of the Atto Disk benchmark, we can make our way into the AS SSD results. And again, what we'll do is we'll bring up our test performance. Oh, wrong button click there. We'll bring up our WD Black AS SSD figures there. So first and foremost, we'll go in with the 1 gig test there. Pop those side by side. And again, higher numbers as expected on the SN850, but not end of this world higher between the two of them. If you're a mid-range PC user and your hardware was never going to be able to hit 7,000 to start with, these are still going to be pretty decent numbers there to be working with. And again, we can flick between the IOPS there. So if we go into the 3 gig test there on screen side by side with the SN700, and we flick that over to the IOPS figure there, we're able to see, let's bring that back, the IOPS figure there, still decent enough numbers there in terms of the performance. And indeed, in terms of IOPS, of course the SN850 is higher, but marginally higher for what you're paying and the architecture inside. And this is still respectable numbers that we're seeing there overall from the SN770. So last, we look at the AJA testing. Now, AJA, as mentioned, slightly different kettle of fish here. We don't want to look at the top number there. What we really want to look at is this graph at the bottom, and what we really wanted to see was the consistency of that line there at the top, because remember, without SD-RAM, it's very hard to ascertain how well this SSD is going to run with sustained activity. So if we bring that there on screen, sort of play with that so it's a little bit more visible, here is how the 1 gig compared. And again, we're looking at the through line there between the two of them, and I've got to say, although there was a dip on the SN850, it was still pretty comparable. If we move to the next one, we look at the 4 gig up and above. Comparable numbers, although we started to see some of those drops there become a little bit more obvious over time. And again, if we make our way into the last test there, we can see there is obviously evidence of the saturation there, but not to the same degree. And overall, this SSD is kind of doing what it's saying. I can't really fault those numbers. If I was running this beast system, I'm under no illusion that it wouldn't hit some of those figures overall. The SN770 is kind of fighting a losing battle against itself in many ways, because as the SN850 has now been in the market for as long as it has, the SN770 runs a risk in terms of its affordability. For example, for £134.99 on their own website, you can get the 1TB mid-range model. And if you just spend £155, so again, barely £20 more, you can get the 850 with markedly improved performance. And that's why I believe the SN770, although it is a good mid-range SSD, its biggest enemy is itself. And we will be doing a comparison there. Even if we look at the 2TB and see how they compare, it's 269 versus 316. And again, you work it down to the percentages, and it's still that same 10 to 20% difference at most between them. And once, that margin seems a little higher, but once you look at the smaller capacities, or even the 500 gig of 77 versus 90, the price difference is enough that the small amount of difference between them more than justifies the purchase on the larger, if older, SSD in terms of performance. Still, if you're in a situation where you're considering a mid-range SSD and the SN770 is, on a good offer, I do recommend it. We will be seeing how it compares against the Sabrent Rocket PCIe4 and, of course, how it compares against the Seagate Firecuda 520 very, very soon. But for now, it's an SSD that I recommend. Although it's not the most impressive SSD they've brought to market, I think there is a market out there for it. And until we find out what WD Black is going to be like in a PCIe Gen 5 generation, I'm glad WD are fleshing out the Gen 4 tier. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Click like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe to learn more. And of course, I will see you on the next video. Take advantage of the free advice section. It's right there in the comments. And of course, see the full review of this SSD over at NAS Compares, linked in the description. Other than that, I will see you next time.